In the complex tapestry of resistance activities that characterized occupied France during World War II, where acts of defiance ranged from distributing underground newspapers to armed sabotage of German installations, one story stands out for its audacity, its scale, and its transformation of the most basic human necessity. One story stands out for its audacity: bread into a weapon of war. The account tells of a French woman who allegedly poisoned bread that was consumed by approximately 400 German soldiers, causing mass illness and possibly deaths among Wehrmacht personnel. An act so devastating that German authorities initially blamed the local baker, in Partsevide, conducting investigations and likely executing or imprisoning an innocent man before eventually discovering the woman's diary that revealed the true perpetrator. This story, which circulates in various forms in accounts of French resistance activities, represents an extreme example of the ways ordinary civilians could strike back against occupying forces, using materials and methods available in daily life, and it highlights both the creativity and the moral complexity of resistance operations that targeted enemy personnel through means that blurred the lines between combatant and civilian, between military action and what might be considered terrorism or war crimes if committed by the other side. However, I must be transparent with you about the historical documentation of this specific story. After searching available historical records, resistance archives and accounts of French resistance activities during World War II, I cannot find verified documentation that confirms this specific incident occurred as described, nor can I locate the name of a specific French woman who carried out such an operation. The story appears in various online sources and informal accounts, but I cannot trace it to primary historical documents, French resistance archives, German military records, or scholarly histories of the occupation period that would confirm them. Details, provide the woman's identity, or verify the circumstances described. This absence of documentation does not necessarily mean the story is false, as many resistance operations were deliberately unrecorded to protect operational security, and many records were destroyed during the war or lost in its aftermath. However, an incident of this magnitude, affecting 400 German soldiers, would likely have generated German military and security service records, French resistance accounts, and post-war documentation if it occurred as described. The absence of such documentation in accessible archives suggests either that the story represents a legend or conflation of multiple smaller incidents, that records remain classified or lost, or that key details of the story as commonly told have been altered through repeated retelling. Nevertheless, the story as it exists deserves examination because it reflects real patterns of resistance activity, raises important questions about the ethics and methods of civilian resistance to military occupation, and whether fully documented or not, has become part of the narrative legacy of French resistance. To understand how such an operation might have been conceived and executed, we must examine the context of German occupation in France, the nature of resistance activities, the opportunities and challenges facing those who sought to strike back at occupying forces, end quote. What have you did, end quote, and the particular methods available to women who participated in resistance operations. France fell to German invasion in June 1940 after a 6-week campaign that shattered French military forces and led to an armistice that divided the country into an occupied zone under direct German military control and an unoccupied zone governed by the collaborationist Vichy regime. The German occupation that followed in northern and western France involved the stationing of hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers, SS personnel, and German administrative officials who requisitioned housing, commandeered food and resources, and imposed occupation policies designed to extract maximum economic benefit for Germany, while suppressing any resistance to German authority. The presence of German military forces throughout occupied France created both the motivation and the opportunities for resistance operations. The French resistance, which began with isolated individual acts of defiance and gradually evolved into organized networks, coordinating with British intelligence and later with Allied military forces, conducted operations that included intelligence gathering, helping Allied airmen escape to neutral countries, sabotaging German military installations and transportation infrastructure, distributing underground newspapers and propaganda, and attacking German personnel through ambush, assassination, and other violent means. Women participated in resistance activities in significant numbers, often exploiting the German assumption that women posed less security threat than men, and therefore might be subject to less intensive scrutiny. The concept of poisoning food destined for German military consumption would have required several elements to succeed. First, the perpetrator would need access to the food supply chain that provided bread or other foodstuffs to German forces. German military units obtained food through several channels, including requisitions from French producers and suppliers, operation of their own military kitchens and bakeries, and purchases from local merchants and vendors. A French woman working in a bakery that supplied German forces, or who had access to such a bakery through employment or personal relationships, could potentially introduce poison into bread or other baked goods before they were delivered to German military units. Second, the perpetrator would need access to poison in sufficient quantities to affect hundreds of soldiers. The types of poison available to a civilian in occupied France would have been limited to substances used in agriculture, household products, or medications that could be diverted to this purpose. Rat poison containing arsenic was commonly available and had been used in various poisoning cases throughout history. Agricultural pesticides and herbicides contain various toxic compounds. Certain plants produced poisonous substances that could be extracted or incorporated into food. The challenge would be obtaining enough poison to affect 400 soldiers while avoiding detection by authorities who monitored sales of potentially dangerous substances, and ensuring the poison could be incorporated into bread in a way that would not be immediately detected through taste, smell, or appearance. Third, the perpetrator would need to execute the poisoning without being observed by co-workers, German personnel who might be present during food preparation or delivery, or informants who might report suspicious behavior to German authorities. The occupation environment in France included both active resistance participants and collaborators who provided information to German security services in exchange for money, favors, or protection. Any suspicious behavior around food preparation could attract attention and investigation. The perpetrator would need to appear to be conducting normal bakery operations while secretly introducing poison into specific batches of bread destined for German consumption. Fourth, the operation would need to avoid poisoning French civilians who might also purchase or consume bread from the same bakery. This requirement would necessitate careful targeting of specific batches of bread that were definitively identified for German military delivery, or would require accepting that some French civilians might be harmed as collateral damage, a morally troubling consideration that highlights the ethical complexities of such operations. Resistance organizations generally tried to minimize harm to French civilians while conducting operations against German targets, both for moral reasons and because harming civilians would undermine popular support for resistance activities. The scale of the alleged poisoning affecting 400 German soldiers suggests either a single large batch of contaminated bread delivered to a concentration of German forces, perhaps a large barracks or base where many soldiers were stationed, or multiple smaller deliveries over time that cumulatively affected this number of personnel. A single incident affecting 400 soldiers simultaneously would have been extraordinarily dramatic, and would certainly have triggered immediate and intensive investigation by German military police and security services. Multiple smaller incidents spread over time might have been less immediately obvious as a coordinated attack, though patterns would eventually emerge as German medical personnel treated soldiers with similar symptoms. The symptoms of poisoning would depend on the specific substance used. Arsenic poisoning produces symptoms including severe gastrointestinal distress, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, and in severe cases cardiovascular collapse and death. Symptoms typically appear within hours of ingestion and worsen over subsequent days. Other poisons produce different symptom patterns, some acting more quickly and others More slowly, German military medical personnel, treating large numbers of soldiers with similar symptoms appearing after consuming bread from the same source, would quickly suspect poisoning rather than natural illness, triggering investigation of the food source. The German response to such an incident would have been swift and brutal. German occupation authorities responded to resistance activities with extreme violence, conducting mass arrests, torturing suspects to extract information about resistance networks, executing those deemed responsible, and often imposing collective punishment on communities where resistance activities occurred. The execution of hostages in retaliation for resistance actions was common German practice, with dozens or even hundreds of French civilians being executed in response to attacks on German personnel. If German authorities believed a baker had poisoned bread supplied to German forces, that individual would have been arrested immediately, interrogated under torture, and almost certainly executed. His family might also have been arrested or harmed, and the bakery would have been destroyed. The story as commonly told includes the detail that German authorities blamed the local baker and presumably punished him before eventually discovering the woman's diary that revealed her as the actual perpetrator. This sequence raises several questions. How did German authorities discover the diary? Was it found during a search of the woman's residence after she came under suspicion for other reasons? Did someone betray her to German authorities, providing information that led to the search? Did she die or disappear, leaving the diary to be discovered later? The discovery of a written confession to such a serious crime would certainly have resulted in the woman's arrest and execution, if she was still alive and could be located. The decision to keep a diary documenting such dangerous activities would have been extraordinarily risky and contrary to standard resistance security practices. Resistance operatives were generally instructed to maintain strict operational security, to avoid keeping written records that could compromise operations or identify fellow resistance members, and to assume that any document they created might fall into German hands through search, arrest, or betrayal. A diary explicitly describing the poisoning of German soldiers would be a death warrant for its author if discovered. This element of the story, while certainly possible, suggests either that the woman was not connected to organized resistance networks that would have trained her in security procedures, or that she felt compelled to document her actions for personal reasons, despite understanding the risks, or possibly that this detail has been added or altered in the retelling of the story. If the story has a factual basis, whether in a single documented incident or as a conflation of multiple smaller operations, it would represent one of the largest single poisoning attacks against military personnel during the occupation. Most documented cases of poisoning and resistance operations involve smaller numbers of targets, individual German officers or officials who were poisoned through food or drink, provided in specific circumstances. The logistics and risks of poisoning 400 soldiers would have required significant planning, access, and risk tolerance. The moral and legal status of such an operation remains contested and complex. From the perspective of the French resistance and Allied powers, attacks on German military personnel in occupied France were legitimate acts of war against an occupying force. German soldiers, as combatants in an aggressive war of conquest, were legitimate military targets. The use of poison, while prohibited in conventional warfare between regular military forces, might be considered a legitimate weapon for resistance fighters who lacked access to conventional military arms and who operated under circumstances where open combat would result in immediate defeat and death. From the German perspective and under the laws of war as they were understood in the 1940s, such actions by civilians not in uniform were considered illegal franc-tireur activity, terrorism, or murder, justifying harsh reprisals and summary execution of perpetrators. The post-war treatment of such actions has varied depending on specific circumstances. Some resistance operations that would have been considered illegal under occupation law were later honored as legitimate resistance activities deserving of recognition and medals. Other operations that crossed certain lines, particularly those resulting in significant civilian casualties or involving methods considered beyond acceptable bounds, even in resistance warfare, have been more controversial. The poisoning of 400 soldiers, if it occurred, would certainly have been celebrated by the resistance and Allied powers as a significant blow against German occupation forces, while being condemned by German authorities as a heinous crime justifying severe reprisals. The absence of clear documentation for this specific story does not diminish the reality that French women did participate in resistance activities and did conduct operations against German forces. Documented examples include women who served as couriers carrying messages and weapons between resistance cells, women who gathered intelligence on German military movements and installations, women who sheltered Allied airmen and helped them escape, women who participated in armed resistance operations, and women who worked in German military facilities and provided intelligence or conducted sabotage. Some women did use poison against individual German targets, though the scale of such operations was typically much smaller than 400 victims. The story, regardless of its precise historical accuracy, serves several narrative functions in the collective memory of French resistance. It demonstrates that resistance could come from unexpected sources and take unexpected forms. It emphasizes women's agency and capability in resistance activities, countering narratives that portray women primarily as victims or passive bystanders during the occupation. It asserts that even the most mundane aspects of daily life, like bread, could be weaponized against occupiers. It provides a narrative of successful resistance action that imposed real costs on German forces. It embodies the spirit of defiance that characterized French resistance, even when specific details may be uncertain or embellished. For anyone seeking to verify this story definitively, the research would require access to German military medical records from occupation forces in France, French resistance archives that might document such operations, post-war investigations of collaboration and resistance activities, local historical records from the community where the incident allegedly occurred, and potentially surviving witnesses, or their descendants, who could provide first-hand accounts. The absence of such documentation and readily accessible sources suggests that if the incident occurred as described, it has not been thoroughly documented in historical literature, or that the story as commonly told represents a simplified or altered version of more complex events. What remains certain is that the French resistance to German occupation was real, widespread, and took many forms. Thousands of French men and women risked and often lost their lives conducting operations against German forces and the Vichy collaborationist government. Women participated in this resistance in ways that are still being fully recognized and documented by historians. The courage required to conduct operations against armed occupiers, knowing that capture meant torture and execution, and that reprisals might be visited upon innocent civilians, deserves profound respect. Whether this specific story of poisoned bread and 400 affected German soldiers represents documented history or resistance legend, it honors the memory of those who fought back and acknowledges the creativity, courage, and determination of French resistors who refused to accept occupation passively. I apologize that I cannot provide you with the specific name of the woman allegedly involved in this incident, as I cannot locate verified documentation of this story that would include such identifying information. If you have additional details about where or when this incident allegedly occurred, or if you've encountered this story in specific sources, I would be happy to help research further to attempt to verify the account and to locate any available documentation.